Good.
All right. And if you hear sounds in the background, my cats are, they're wide awake, so they're just kind of hanging out. So, all right. So, let's see. As far as our book goes, I'm trying to think of what the official title is. W.E.B. Du Bois, Data Portraits. I feel kind of silly, like, not knowing what the actual title of the book is, but I mean, like, it's mostly just an edited commentary on some sociology data and visualization that Du Bois and his students at Atlanta University did in 1900. That's my understanding. So, I'll be honest in saying that I have embarrassingly little familiarity with any of W.B. Du Bois's sociology type work. I don't know if you have like any experience with that. I mostly picked this just because I thought the data visualization would be cool and useful for me since it's where my research is taking me. I don't know, Gina, what your stake in this is, or if you have like any perspectives that you're bringing into this book in particular.
I think mine is almost the complete opposite of you, where it means that I have no experience with, I mean, data visualizations, I know it, but I've never actually worked with them. So I thought this would be a really good place to start. And my understanding of WB's, well, any of his work has just been mostly his theory, because a lot of theorists, like, I'm thinking of, I'll give a couple like names now, because I like went back to look for some readings, but there's this one piece, like essay by Stuart Hall. He talks about new ethnicities, and it talks about how, especially for like Black African American communities after like segregation, slavery, and Jim Crow, had to find their own ethnicity, because they couldn't go back to just saying, oh, I'm from this country in Africa. They had to look for, okay, this is the Black collective identity. Hence, and it reflects back in how in the book you have two separate parts, and you talk about like the Georgia, I'm going to use the words from the book because I don't know what else I would use, but Georgia Negroes.
Yeah.
Like that's what he talks about, how these people, wherever they are from, now they are from this place, and now we will show you that we will represent them through data. And I thought that was really interesting. It reflected how important things like census numbers and data is to the creation and appropriation of a culture. And such a unique culture, which is basically you've been oppressed and now you're not, but you're still being oppressed.
Yeah.
It's a very gray line, and now you're representing what is a very essentially a gray line through clear and clean and visually awesome data. I think that was what I got from the book.
Definitely. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. Most of what I have experienced as far as Du Bois' like work within academia has been mostly theory driven, like you mentioned. Like I've read The Souls of Black Folks because I think that that's just like one of the, it's a crux that comes with studying critical race theory. Like everyone really should read that book, I think. But I didn't know that Du Bois was so big in the social sciences aspect of it. I knew, like, just from what I know from culture about Du Bois, that he dabbled in a little bit of everything and was kind of, the Renaissance man of the mid-19th century for the Black community in the South, but I didn't know that he had explicitly like done sociology research with the intent of collecting data and representing it in a meaningful way to people within the the Black community and outside of it in the United States and abroad. And I seriously had no clue whatsoever that these plates or that these photographs or these tables were even in existence. I guess for anyone watching, and you can correct me if I get any of the details wrong, Gina, but I kind of absorbed this because I thought it was interesting. The graphs that comprise a good chunk of this book are tables pulled from the 1900 Paris World's Fair, the exhibition where Dubois' sociology friend, whose name fails me, but that I'm sure have bookmarked, Callaway. I have like my handy dandy Kindle here that has all my notes bookmarked. But Callaway was a sociologist who was good friends with Dubois, knew his efforts to try and highlight and elevate the progress and intellect of the Black community in Georgia, especially. And he's who really helps Dubois get sort of the ability to do this project, just because, you know, there racism and Jim Crow was still such a big issue at the time that it was very difficult institutionally for Dubois to get this project off the ground himself, even though he had the students who were interested and he had the intellect and the knowledge. But I think that it's worth noting towards the beginning of the book, there is a quote that I have pulled that I just really enjoyed. Dubois was among the first professors in the nation to train students in sociological theory and empirical methodologies. He involved his students in field work wherein they collected and analyzed data on the Black community and race relations, and they covered a lot of territory in these plates. There's like upwards of 60 of them where they're just visualizing data about various aspects about what they would call the Negro life and the Negro experience after the era of chattel slavery, really with the intent of highlighting progress that's developing in spite of difficulty and in spite of what misconceptions and stereotypes about that community may be. So I think it's really interesting that the editors point out not just that Dubois was like one of the first Black professors to do this, one of the first Americans. No, he was one of the first professors to do this sort of field work that we're doing like 100 years into the future. So I kind of spiraled off just because I think it's really interesting. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Jada? Because I don't know which section you focus the most on, but I think that a lot of my attention like went to getting myself familiar with the research through the introduction, and then I kind of like dabbled in the plates because, you know, I feel that having experience with Gephi and data visualization, not necessarily that it made the tables easier for me to look at, they're pretty easy to absorb on their own, but it was less, you know, I have to remember and absorb information in order to like make sense of it. So I don't know if there were any points throughout the book that you thought were interesting, or any comments that he mentioned.
I think I had a very similar experience when it came to, I focused on the introduction, like analyzed the introductions and what they were trying to say. And then I looked through all of the plates, and I like kind of picked a few I thought were not, obviously they were all really poignant, but I kind of picked a few that I thought were especially very nice to look at. It's just aesthetically really nice to look at, or maybe there was a really good like long description talking about the plate itself. So I did a couple of things like that. And I think the most important, like most obvious plate would be the one on the cover. Mm-hmm. There's that spiraling one on the cover, and if only I could, should we bring it up on the
Let me bring it up real quick because I can pull up the cover here. I can share my screen. Yeah.
And it's like, it's specifically that cover. It's either this one or another similarly spiraling one. And there's, this one especially. And if I'm right, I think it's occupations.
I think that there's one that's very similar that shows like the occupations of the Black community. Mm-hmm. I think that this one is the total wealth that is held by the Black community in Georgia at varying points in times. Mm-hmm. But I think that I noticed the spiral, or like the kind of wiggly lines, kind of just something that I noticed looking through the plates. It's a pretty big motif that Dubois and his students chose to go with to, you know, visualize the data. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of points when it's really, really poignant how the data kind of like, it gets so expansive that it would go off the page if they didn't loop it back around. I'll see if I can find some others while you're talking, but I think it's worth mentioning for anyone who like is watching this and hasn't gotten to read the book yet, that like the data is drawn to scale, which, considering that really the technology they had were pens and paper and stylo pens and stuff like that, that's really impressive that they were able to do the math necessary. I just kind of plug numbers into a computer and hope the computer does it for me. But this one I would definitely agree is one of the most poignant, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's just the one that is definitely the most aesthetically pleasing in my opinion, but it's the one that conveys really important information about like the progress and success of the Black community at this time. I'll go ahead and stop sharing as I try and find the other tables, but I feel like I interrupted you in the middle as I was finding that, but
no, I completely agree with every single thing you said. And,
okay.
And especially the spiraling motif, one of the words used while describing this plate, and especially the ones with the spiraling motifs, was the word hypnotic.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting. Firstly, because obviously in context of this class, digital humanities, very new to me. But one thing I noticed in digital humanities was just the importance of general data visualization. And when it comes to data visualization, aesthetics are extremely, I'm sure aesthetics are important for a lot of things, but anything you have that has to do with visualization does have to look at aesthetic. And aesthetic, and then you can connect aesthetic to hypnoticism. Then in the book itself, there's this one part, I think the first introduction, where one of the authors says double consciousness to describe the experience of seeing oneself through the eyes of another, a psychic alienation and the social isolation produced by the peculiar condition of being Black in America. Data visualize, I think there is definitely a link between seeing yourself as a Black person in America and the same experience of seeing data, seeing the plates of data. And I think that was what that was maybe a part of what Dubois was trying to convey, was seeing yourself, whether it's alienating or hypnotic. It might be a good thing, but it's also an important thing. And I think that was one of the, that was just one phrase that stuck out to me when I first saw this plate and I didn't understand it at all. And then I read through the book and I went back to it and I was like, oh, so that's what he means by seeing yourself. And in the introduction itself, there was a lot of pride. Generally, the introduction was all like praising Dubois, and I was like, that's obviously well deserved. And it also made me think of how much that maybe to some extent Black people just didn't see themselves. They didn't see themselves represented anywhere. And then seeing themselves aesthetically represented in data compared to what was usually being shown about them, because race science got really popular then. Darwinism was being used as a tool to say that, oh, this is why they are inferior to white people. This is why, that's why they're going to get extinct sooner. So we just have to make use of them. That was how white race scientists kind of spun that narrative. And I think that's what the aestheticism of all the plates is trying to counter it, saying that that's wrong. Obviously, it was always wrong, but the aestheticness of seeing yourself and seeing yourself as like a Black person being aesthetic might just be the contrast, and the way Dubois is trying to say it's not like you're out of place. It is just a matter of how data is presented rather than you being wrong. Does that make sense? I feel like I want to know
that makes perfect sense. And I think there is definitely something to be said about, especially in this era, given the context of when Dubois was doing this research, when it was coming to light for, the rest of the Western world, as it were, and how it had to be represented. That double consciousness, it is mentioned in the book towards the introduction. And it's very important to kind of consider the context of not just how Dubois was trying to represent the Black community to, in a way that would make them visible, but in a way that would make them accessible to people who maybe did not understand their struggles or their triumphs in the face of struggles. There are a couple of plates, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time when I screen share, because like I can't zoom in on the images on my desktop the way that I can when I'm on PC. I'm going to see like if I can fiddle with that as I talk, but there's like let's see, can I show one column only? There we go. It's a little bit better to look at. So some of the plates emphasize information that
I don't think it's come up.
it hasn't come up yet. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Sorry, I was fiddling with the settings to see if I could get it to look at like one page instead of two.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's worth noting that there are a lot of different plates, and I'll just kind of find the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head from memory. They visualize data in a way that I think, looking from where I am without knowing the context, I would consider it kind of peculiar. I think that there's like, you know, there's a lot of bar charts, a couple of heat maps, which were really revolutionary, but then there are tables and plates that emphasize information in a way that maybe I would not consider industry standard as far as data visualization goes, but it's also important to remember that what Dubois was doing was not just revolutionary, it was designed for a white audience in Europe and potentially some American people that were there visiting, so the information had to be accessible to them. This is actually plate 10. I don't know why the little subtitles that go with each plate are not connected, but this one, as it explains, is a tricolor chart, stacks 3 pairs of bars representing Germans and Black Americans of different marital statuses. Red sections for single, yellow for married, and green for widowed or divorced. These are then divided according to designated age ranges, and I was looking at this, I can't really zoom in on it, but if you look at it, you can kind of see what it's talking about, where it's representing the marital condition of different communities. You know, you can see some pretty solid similarities there, and that's what I believe Dubois was trying to emphasize. But I was sitting there reading this, like, why the heck did he choose Germany as, like, the control group, so to speak? It explains, Dubois chooses Germany, a neighboring presenter at the Paris exposition, as a point of comparison in order to elevate the status of Black Americans in the eye of audiences abroad and at home. He does this by building a graphic relationship between African American populations and mainly white populations of a major European power. So I thought this was really interesting in that he chose a control that worked for his specific data set. I don't think Germany makes an appearance at any other point in these tables, but it was a really brilliant way to show, you know, sort of the similarities that develop between, you know, the Black formerly enslaved community of the American South and a really successful kind of first-class European power, with the intent of explaining, hey, these people aren't so different after all. Like, you really have no reason to think that the Black community is, you know, less evolved, less elevated, less intellectual, less normative than you guys think that you are. They're very similar, and this data shows that. So I think that understanding that context is really important to mention, and it's just a really fun point to bring up, in the sense that, like, the data without that context may come across as a little bit strange, but it's important to remember that these were plates being shown to people who did not have any knowledge of sociology, probably. Some of them probably dabbled a little bit because it was, you know, the exhibition where, you know, everyone was coming together, showing research, showing progress that their nation had developed, but it also had to be accessible to whoever was coming just to look at the sites. And in that way, it's colorful, it's fun to look at, it's spiral, it's hypnotic, like you mentioned. And I think that having those kind of standards that maybe I would not consider necessary are really important for the playing field of that time. And that kind of makes me think about how, like, what I choose as, my control, my standard base for whatever research I may do is totally relevant to what I'm doing in 2021 with the research I'm doing, and how it's completely subjective and important to the context. So I don't know if there are any other tables you saw or if you had any thoughts, but I can totally pull up whichever ones you think are interesting, because I think we can spend the next hour looking at these, honestly, and picking them apart.
Yeah, I feel like that's also the point. All the tables have the same quality that art even has when it comes to, I think it means this, well, I think it means that. There's a lot of subjectivity, but it's also very hard, clean data, which is so interesting and well done. And also, one of the things, speaking of one of the things you said earlier when it came to using Germany as a control group to portray that, oh, look, they're not as different. Black people aren't as different from us. I also feel like there is a lot of context for Dubois' life himself, because I think it mentions in the introduction as well. He was brought up in a place where, rather than violent racial lynchings, it was a lot softer. There was discrimination, but it was like soft racism compared to when he went to university in the South. I think that's when he went to Georgia. And that's when he had to like live completely segregated. And I think that experience itself probably has a lot to do with the control group, which again made me think about, oh, okay, so the control group isn't exactly like this unbiased viewer. The control group is a control group for your data, for what you're trying to say. This is not a criticism. It's just a very, again, as you mentioned, ingenious way of showing that, in a way, Dubois, in a way, kind of saying, I think he mentions also in the introduction, one of the quotes was, he had a desire to outperform his white peers, especially in schools. So in a way, his existence in itself was like a, what's the word, a denial, a protest against race science, saying he couldn't do it.
Yeah.
In a way, Dubois himself was a data point, I think. And I think that was a very important part of representation.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think that kind of marking Dubois as, a point of data himself, kind of a representation of I don't want to say turning point, because there are still so many issues that come with segregation and discrimination, but kind of a shifting perspective that was able to be accessed around that time. I think that there's another table, if I can share, that kind of goes in line with what you were saying. It's number 17, number of Negro students taking the various courses of study offered in Georgia schools. Now, you can't really see these, but there are quite a few. I think business, there is, I know that scientific, normal, a couple of different like standards. I can't really read all of them. Let me see if I can pull it up on my my actual Kindle, where I can actually read the stuff and like figure it out. But if you give me 1 second. There we go. So from the top to the bottom, they are business, 12 students, classical, 88, professional, 152, scientific, 161, normal or teaching, education track is 383, and then industrial is 2,252, which snakes around, which I think is, I think it's fascinating that the data is visualized in this way. I think that the bar chart is really conducive to what Dubois and his students were looking to do. But it's interesting to me that he chose a scale that was in such a way that the data literally could not be represented on a single page if it had just gone linearly. Like, it had to snake around to show the proportion. And it really shows the outlier of students, of Black students being enrolled in industrial education. And I think that kind of shows I think in my interpretation, and of course, I'm not sure if this is what Dubois was going for or, you know, what the end goal was at the time. This kind of takes me back to like the prevalent idea that at the time that Black students should be in a more manual sort of
Yep.
career, that they should be in industrial education. So this is really showing that, you know, this outlier is significant in that there are so many students kind of following the status quo, so to speak, for what was considered acceptable for them. But also you can't deny that there are, you know, hundreds of students who were, you know, of the descent of formerly enslaved folks who may have been enslaved themselves, who are taking classes at schools designed to help in other industries. And you can't deny the fact that there are about like 3,000 Black students enrolled in higher education courses to get an education, not just to do manual labor or domestic labor or things that are considered uneducated or unintellectual. So this one, it's interesting to me just because of how the data is visualized, but also the information it presents. It shows information that may have reaffirmed in some ways what the white community of America and of Europe would expect of the Black community in the American South, but also kind of questioning it at the same time. So there is that level of double consciousness and like cognitive dissonance that comes with this one graph that I think is really interesting to focus on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And similarly to what you said about like the thing snaking, was that, sorry, my brain was like, what were you trying to say?
No, you're fine.
Anyway, yeah. So I was also going to say that it is also a really interesting way to talk about how industrial jobs also tend to be oddly invisible jobs. They tend to be very like, even now in current, like, and especially now, even if you look at factories under what we can under this like capitalist society, all the factories are in a very specific location. They're not in any, you don't see factories and industrial anything happening around people in urban areas. And I think that the linkage, the huge rise of industrial also links up to the fact that there's another chart which talks about how the number of Black people in cities, urban areas, versus the number of Black people in rural areas. Like the disparity is huge. And I feel like this is how the graphs like link up to each other to some extent. Like by themselves it's something, but the fact that there's so many, all of them linking to each other in some way, is, I feel like, what makes this, what have made the exhibition that much more revolutionary. It wasn't just one graph that said one thing, it was several graphs saying several things, all connected with each other.
Yeah, they all really shared that narrative, and I'm going to share my screen because I think I know exactly which one you're talking about. This is the other really fun spiral one where, if I can double check, I have it pulled up on my Kindle, so hopefully I can make this legible for everyone in some way. But this is kind of that comparison of city and rural populations, and they tie into each other really, really well. There's the sense that it's like a bar chart, a line chart, a pie chart. It's so many different things, but the green represents 78,139 Negroes in cities of over 10,000 inhabitants. The blue, the little blue sliver here that might be difficult to see, represents Negroes in cities from 5,000 to 10,000. There's roughly around 8,000 of them. 37,699 Negroes in cities from 2,500 to 5,000, and then Negroes living in country and villages, there are just shy of 734,952. So, of course, the data is again to scale, but the way that it was represented, it would be off the charts. And I think that this is a really, fun and engaging way to kind of visualize what disparities really exist. The idea that a lot of the Black community in, 1890, just 10 years before this was presented at the exposition, and only a couple decades after the formal end of chattel slavery, a lot of the Black community is still likely in the area where they have lived for centuries just due to the circumstances. So it's just really fragmented. And as the editors point out, this text paired with each segment reads more like a narrative than a typical key. And I think that that really goes in line with what you're saying about how all the data connects to each other. All these tables connect to each other and tell a story, which is ultimately what data visualization is trying to do. You take something that maybe, when you're just looking at numbers and letters, it might be difficult to interpret on its own, but when visualized, it creates a clear story that hopefully anyone can access and make meaning of. So definitely, I'm glad that you brought that one up, because that's another one of my favorites. I remembered the image of it, but I couldn't remember exactly what the data was, which I think really speaks to how engaging the visualization in and of itself is. Let's see.
Yeah, exactly. And that must have been on purpose. You can't just the different colors and all the small details coupled with the huge spiral. There has to have been very consciously done and consciously presented, I think. And I thought that was such an amazing way of showing, as I think one of the other introductions said, sense of pride, and a pride of showing that, this might be who we are, but we need to see it first. Because what always happens, I feel like one of the things Dupa was trying to fight was this was stereotype, and again race science stereotype, all naturalized concepts that people in power, white people in power at the time, must have taken for granted. He was trying to say, actually, you're wrong, because the majority of the population that were stolen from their homeland were slaves, and then therefore used in agriculture. Where else does agriculture happen except for rural areas? So where does your misconception of the Black person come from? If not, if it's not trickled from you never actually meeting a Black person, but now you will see these images and you will remember them.
Yeah.
You will remember that spiral. And I think that I just thought that was such an amazing way to show a narrative instead of just saying it. You have amazing books to talk about the slave experience, but I just thought this was so unique for its time. And even now it's pretty, I wouldn't know, obviously. I don't know anything about data visualization, but I, as someone who just had to look at tables and graphs doing science in high school, it's just already so much more engaging. It's already just, I want to look at this.
Exactly.
Way more so.
And I think that going back to the context of when this research was done and presented, like you mentioned, Dubois at, doing research in Atlanta, he was subject to discrimination. He really had to toe the line of what was expected and accessible of a Black intellectual at the time. So struggle for grant funding, even more so than I imagine. Grant funding has never been an easy effort, an easy thing to get in higher education, but even worse if you're subject to discrimination and Jim Crow laws, and being in an area filled with prejudice towards, your race, the race that you have been designated or that you are, trying to speak for. So there were issues, of course, with getting the money to do the research, to get the resources to make the graphs, to get the students who were able to assist in the field work in the project, then get to Paris and present the information. And then it's worth mentioning, they talk about this in the book, that the Paris exposition was just filled with progress, of course, that was the whole point of it, but the progress was skewed towards the development of the white Anglo-Saxon community at the time, showing how great, you know, the white community is. Look at all the progress we're making and how we're better than everyone else, kind of to the detriment of all other groups, I guess, if you want to call them that. There was a huge investment in social Darwinism. So I imagine kind of like if I was there seeing all these people, you know, you go from one, you know, display it's like social Darwinism, look how cool we are compared to every other, you know, community in the entire world. And then you get to Dubois and you see, you know, 500 candid images showing the daily life of the Black community that posits them as like real human beings that aren't just like there to be, you know, inferior to you and your group. And then you see all these portraits and this data presented in such an engaging way that, like you said, you want to look at it, you want to remember what was being shared there. And I can imagine that, you know, spending a reasonable amount of time looking at Dubois' research was possible and, you know, probably desired at some point for some of the people that were there. But there were a lot of other exhibitions, so I think that Dubois did a really awesome job, and it's ingenious that he was able to make the information so accessible in such a short amount of time, given the context of who was viewing it, when they were viewing it, and what else they had to prioritize while they were there. So, and it's really cool because it shows such a positive perspective that that not many people would have been considering at the time had they not lived through those experiences firsthand or seen the progress or done the research themselves. But it still makes it accessible as if they were there. So I think that's really cool. And I'm really glad that I chose this book because this is the one that I knew the least about its existence, but it presented the most information that I think I will take with me and consider when I'm doing future research in digital humanities.
I think similarly along that line, I thought the implication of the you know, the ones with the maps, the cartography data ones, I thought those were one of the coolest because it was just a explanation of how something as simple as a map, you don't realize that it centers a very white west, it centers white westernism, it centers it, and then seeing like the lines going across the sea and like just representing something as horrific as the slave trade as just lines, but colors, and then the 60 plates of stories that come along with it. I just thought it was such a good way to not reduce. I didn't think any of the plates were reductionist in any way. I feel like to some extent you can say, oh no, but it's just data. Oh, sorry, that was mine.
No, you're
fine. Like it's just data. How could you possibly encapsulate the experience of oppression that they've gone through? I think because it's not only was it was more than the just data. I think that was what Dubois was trying to say. So same way, the slave is more than an object, a piece of property. It's more than a piece of data. It's something you want to look at. It's something that engages you, something that makes you remember. And that's the same thing as a person. I feel like that was a theme. I'm just thinking of general themes of this book.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally agree. I'm trying to find the one that you were talking about because I think I know which one it is, but I can't remember where it is. The one that represents.
It's definitely in the introduction. I think some page. Please, Lord.
Let's see.
It's before page 40.
Okay, I'll go ahead and take a look because the introduction is also chock full of really awesome.
Yeah. Oh, page 47.
Page 47. All right.
I think that's the one.
Okay.
Is it that one? Because I think it's literally the first plate.
Yeah. Let me see if I can, because I am pulling up page 47. It's weird, like the way that the Kindle does it. It's like a slider bar to go to whatever page you want.
Yeah, no, same. It was really strange for me reading it.
Yeah.
Going back and forth.
So, let's see. Yeah, let me go ahead and share because this one is really interesting as well. I mean, they're all interesting, of course, but
Yeah.
this one is, it's the only one that I mean, they all have, cartography in some way, but this one is the only one that kind of looks at the whole globe and shows, the whole encompassing picture of, what the research was looking to do, what it was attempting to accomplish. And if I can pull up the page on my end, I will read what the little caption says here. So the lines represent the American slave trade, routes of American slave trade. So you can kind of see where these lines are leading, what the routes were, and I don't know that there is a specific table for it, but I think that it can be extrapolated that the darker colored areas have the greatest distribution of Black enslaved people at the time, and you can kind of see there's a little star here that's not that visible, but that's where Georgia is located. So great information for people who maybe are not from America and don't know where Georgia is on a map. But the caption under it says, "This case is devoted to a series of charts, maps, and other devices designed to illustrate the development of the American Negro in a single typical state of the United States. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." So definitely he makes it very clear from the beginning that this research looks to demonstrate how, not just progress is happening, but how the misconceptions about the progress happening within the Black community are the main issue being faced just globally and within the nation, that the issue with progress is in the lack of recognition and the lack of familiarity that's happening. So I think that hopefully that made some sense. It's a lot of information to absorb in one little map. It covers so much, just showing the the diaspora of a particular group of people and how they have made progress in spite of past and ongoing adversity in this nation, and how we can make that information accessible to other people. He was doing digital humanities before digital was even a thing, so I just think that this research he's doing is so cool. So do you have any other thoughts? Because I think that I've definitely covered everything that I think is, I mean, of course I could go on, but I think
I think both of us can.
done like spark notes for anyone who hasn't read this and wants to know what's going on, maybe, kind of wants to know which plates might be the most interesting to me and you, or, anyone kind of looking from the outside in. But I'm wondering if you have any other closing thoughts before we kind of wrap up.
Any closing thoughts would be that the plates themselves, I think the plates are a very good representation of the phrase, "a picture's worth 1,000 words." And especially in this case, a picture is worth 1,000, hundreds of years of oppression. I feel like that was what,
It's
I feel like
great.
that would be the gist of it, because it's not reductionist in any way. It's just very clear and very simple what happened. And I think that was always the point of it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the word I might assign to this set of data is digestible and accessible. It's definitely not reductionist. I mean, looking at it, it can kind of seem like just very simplistic,
colors and lines
forward, but looking at what it represents and how it's portrayed, it's very obvious to see how much care and thought and craft went into every single one of these 62 odd plates that were presented, and even more so for the whole exposition, as far as getting it choreographed, getting it set up, presenting the information in a particularly accessible way, using the photos that Dubois thought were important. Because I know if you look at like the beginning, I'll see if I can pull it up and share it. There's actually a picture of what the exposition looked like in 1900. Let me see, I just pulled it up. So I mean, if you look here, you can kind of see a photo of how that information would have been presented to someone walking in to see it. Photos up here just of, you know, kind of quotidian examples of what life was like in America for the Black community. You got some of the tables down here. It's so much data, and it's presented in a way that even someone who doesn't know anything about sociology or statistics or even the Black community and its struggles at the time, it's completely accessible and engaging to read, I would say, and engaging to look at. So I think that you made some great comments about that.
Likewise. I think we're good. I mean, obviously all of them are great plates. They're really easy read.
Yeah.
For anybody, I think if you're intimidated by the data tab plates in any way, I think I would just say don't be. It's not that bad. As even for someone like me who had no experience, it was very, very digestible.
Yeah, exactly. All the data is kind of encapsulated within around 100 pages, and it's worth noting that towards the latter half of the book, where there are the plates after kind of the prelude to, you know, what the context was, what they represent, what Dubois went through to get the information there. The latter half of the book is just the plates themselves with explanation and commentary on what they represented and how essential they were at the time. And it's only less than $10 on Amazon to get it like digitally. So I totally recommend getting this if you have any desire to look at the history of, you know, critical race theory and of data visualization. If you have any desire to kind of go forward with digital humanities, I think this is a great foundational book and, you know, originating set of data to really look at to hone in what you're trying to do. So yeah. All right. Well, that's everything I got. I'll go ahead and stop the recording so we can upload this later. But